Late winter, year 126. A small group of dwarves set out from the mountain homes to form a colony in a distant land. Their ranks comprise of 4 distinct and separate houses or factions from their civilization: craftsmen, soldiers, scholars, and administrators. Despite their previous bickerings, these 4 houses are ready to set their differences aside, work together for the common good of the Dwarven Empire. Unfortunately though, not everything goes to plan and the dwarves find themselves stranded in a hostile tundra. Believing that they'll be here for a while, they decide to dig in and wait for help to arrive. This Let's Play is the story of how these 4 factions coexisted and built a thriving fortress against all odds. Welcome home. Welcome to MountainFactions. Hello there guys, what's going on? I'm Bryn, I'm the Game Survivor. I hope you enjoyed that very melodramatic intro there. As I said in the intro, this Let's Play is kind of unique in that instead of just being sort of one fortress working towards a common goal, there's 4 individual factions within a fortress, sort of vying for control, vying for power, and this Let's Play is all about trying to get them to cooperate in some meaningful way. There's the red combat house, the Ang house, there's House Inol, which is the yellow craft dwarf-y kind of house. There's House Rushrul, which is the blue leader house, and the green house, House Arul, are the scholar and farmer house. Now this Let's Play, as I said, is all about getting these houses to cooperate in some meaningful way. There's going to be combat between them, there's going to be some kind of conflict, there's going to be arguments, there's going to be power disputes, and that's what's going to make this Let's Play so interesting and unique. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Now, as you were probably observing there, the miners from House Ang were digging out some farming areas, but unfortunately these farming areas weren't actually on soil, they were on rocks, and House Rushrul are a little bit peeved about that. The leader house are not so happy, so House Ang have to redig some channels to see if they can find some good soil to plant some plants. And they eventually do, and House Arul start planting down some plants to feed the fortress. And by the way, don't stress if you're not keeping up with which houses are which. I'll be popping them up on the screen every now and then to remind you guys in case you're a little bit behind. That's okay. Now, as you can see, the farmers from House Arul have suggested to the expedition leader from House Rushrul that the old accidental stone farmland gets turned into stockpiles, and that's exactly what's happened. And the miners from House Ang are digging out 5 separate floors, 1 floor for sort of a communal area for all the houses can mix, and 1 floor each for House Ang, Rushrul, Inol, and Arul. The 2 miners from House Ang, since they're soldiers as well, they managed to convince the leaders of House Rushrul that they can build a little bolt hole up to the top of the surface of their fortress so that they can get up there really quickly to deal with any invaders as necessary. And House Rushrul reluctantly agree to that. They don't want to give too much freedom to the soldiers, but they decide it's probably for the best for the safety of the fortress. Now, quite a few months have passed by this point. It's now late spring, and the leaders from House Rushrul are starting to realize that maybe there's no help coming in the immediate future. So they decide to dig out some stockpiles so that they can stockpile some food, some liquor, any resources that they might need, just in case they have to make it through a winter, which would be quite unfortunate since they are in a tundra. It's going to be quite hostile in the winter. Now, similarly, they start digging out some lodgings. They start with the craft dwarves first, since they're the proudest house. Then they're complaining about having to sleep on the ground, and so House Ang are drafted to dig out some lodgings for them. And House Ang also, as sort of recompense for that, they decided that they want to dig out a barracks as well, just in case goblins or kobolds decide to ambush them and try to steal their goods. Now, it's around about this time that the first argument between any 2 houses starts to break out. House Inol decide to put down a carpenter's workbench so that they can start making some beds for everyone to sleep in, which is important. You know, House Inol were trying to do the right thing here. But House Rushrul decide it's far more important to put down a trade depot because the expedition leader has decided that this would be a good place to settle, at least for a short period of time. So they have to demolish the carpenter's workbench in order to put it down. And House Inol are outraged because they believe that building beds for them to sleep in is far more important than accounting for the potential that maybe there might be someone who'll want to trade with them, which is kind of fair enough, I suppose. In similar news, the other factions start getting a little bit pissed off at House Ang, who are spending an awful lot of time making sure that their barracks is spick and span and really well constructed, while they're not even bothering to start digging out the lodgings for the other houses. And that's making some of the dwarves a little bit angsty, which is kind of fair enough. Now that their barracks is complete, since they're going to be there for a while, House Rushrul requests that House Ang put together a bit of a militia, and that's exactly what they do. The two miners start training in their spare time to make sure that if there's goblins or kobolds that come along that try and steal their children or whatever, that they'll be prepared. And this is where House Rushrul decides that that bolt hole was probably a good idea in the end. Not that they tell House Ang that. They wouldn't back down in any way like that. Just before the end of spring, the first few bedrooms of House Inol's floor start getting set up, and a few spaces for workbenches are being dug out as well as a few new plots of land are built by House Arul, the farming house. Now, since they're just sort of sitting around twiddling their thumbs at this point, House Inol decides to set up some workbenches to ply their trades, to make themselves a little bit more useful. And while that's happening, House Rushrul are starting to get a little bit annoyed that their quarters, their comfortable, roomy quarters, haven't been dug out yet. And so House Ang are ordered immediately to start digging those out at the orders of the expedition leader. Now, the leaders of House Rushrul decided to send a carrier pigeon back home to the mountain homes to see if they can procure some transport back home or to continue their journey, because they don't particularly enjoy being stuck here. And they hadn't heard anything back for quite a few months until some migrants, in inverted commas, arrived and said, "Oh, this is a fantastic place. We're going to, we heard about your carrier pigeon. We're going to come and settle with you." And the leaders of House Rushrul are like, "What the hell is going on here? we do not enjoy it here. You guys aren't going to enjoy it here either. We need to go home." And the migrants said, no, we're on orders to come and settle with you guys. So we're making this into a permanent encampment. And the leaders are pretty skeptical about this, especially considering most of them are from House Arul and House Inol. They're pretty skeptical considering there's no House Rushrul migrants coming with them. So they're pretty distrusting of this new group. Now, while House Rushrul may have thought that the new migrants were just sort of extra mouths to feed, it does turn out that there's actually some useful dwarves coming with the migrant wave, including a jeweler and a seasoned killer. As you can see, he's killed one goblin, making him the most experienced combat veteran in the fortress. By the end of summer, House Ang have dug out the first grand dining hall for the fortress as well on the communal floor, and the dwarves are well and truly beginning to settle into their new home. Now, a joint committee of House Ang and House Rushrul members at the start of autumn decide that since they're going to be here for a while, they'd better take a look at the defensibility of the new fortress. And they decide it's really not all that defensible at the moment. So they decide to put up some rock walls to help defend from not only the elements, but also from wild creatures and goblins and kobolds who might be coming to steal their loot. Obviously, it's going to take a while to get these up, but they believe that it's probably going to be worth the time and resources in the long run. Now, since there's only two members of House Rushrul at this point, the leaders are starting to get a little bit concerned and paranoid because they're vastly outnumbered by the rest of the factions. So they secretly draft one of the members of House Ang to start digging out a stockpile room on their floor of the fortress. They also start blocking off the entrance to their floor with doors, which is a very interesting move. We'll see how that ends up playing out for the rest of the fortress. Hopefully it won't be too negative an impact. In a similar move, in an attempt to curb the amount of power that House Inol has in the fortress at the moment, House Rushrul decide to commission House Ang to do all the smelting and furnace work in the fortress. And now this is going to shift the balance of power in the fortress away from House Inol, which is quite interesting, quite an interesting move. But House Inol is still probably the dominant power in the fortress at the moment. Now, after a little while, it seems that House Rushrul's prayers have finally been answered, because the first official liaison from the mountain homes finally arrives in the form of a caravan, a trade caravan. So it turns out that they were right to set up that trade depot after all. Now, once the traders have unloaded all their goods, House Rushrul leaders walk up to them and make some conversation, asking about when they'll be allowed to go home. And the traders are saying, no, you're not allowed to go home. This is where you're setting up your colony. And House Rushrul have been hanging on to hope that they might be heading home to the comforts of the mountain home anytime soon, while the other houses have sort of been getting ready to settle into their new lives at MountainFactions. And so the leaders of House Rushrul are absolutely outraged, and they turn the caravan away in disgust, because they're so disappointed that they're not allowed to go home. Now, this really outrages House Inol, who were ready to trade some of the goods that they'd been producing at their workbenches throughout the year, and this sparks a bit of an argument between the leaders of House Rushrul and House Inol. Now, this argument prompts House Rushrul to start spiriting food and weapons and wine away in their little stockpile that they had built up. And they say this is so that they can become a little bit more independent and not rely on the other factions so much. But there are rumors that they are trying to just defend themselves as much as possible from a potential attack from House Inol or any of the other houses in the fortress. And this is a very, very interesting move that could lead to some open conflict in the fortress. Hopefully not. I've got my fingers crossed that it won't lead to open conflict, but it may very well do. A few weeks later, everything's ticking along just nicely, and there aren't any signs of combat in the fortress, but all of a sudden, one of the members of House Inol requests a house transfer. Now, these are possible within the Dwarven civilization that MountainFactions is set in, but they're extremely rare, and they're often quite difficult to enact, and they've never actually been done in a colony before. One of the members of House Inol is requesting a transfer to House Ang so that he can become a soldier, because he's quite an accomplished spear dwarf, and he wants to become a professional soldier. And to House Rushrul, this is simply unacceptable. Granting any concessions like this to House Inol is absolutely not possible at this point. Relations are too frigid, and so they put their foot down and say no. But House Ang overrules them in a vote of all the houses. All the houses overrule them, and the House Inol individual is permitted to cross over into House Ang to become a soldier. Now, this absolutely outrages House Rushrul, and so the two members of the house decide to kidnap the new member of House Ang and spirit him away in House Rushrul's floor and block off the doors. At this point, House Rushrul think they're pretty safe. They've got all the food and resources that they need in their little stockpile that has been put there by the rest of the houses. But as it turns out, House Inol and House Ang in particular were quite concerned that this might happen. And so instead of putting food in the stockpiles as ordered, they decided to put in just fat. And so the House Rushrul members and the kidnapped member of House Ang don't actually have any food with them, and so they're hoping that instead of starving to death, the House Rushrul members will make some concessions and release the new member of House Ang. After a few weeks of waiting though, it doesn't look like that's going to end up happening, and so House Ang decide to break in and free their new member. Instead of trying to bash down the doors, because that would be what House Rushrul would expect, they decide to dig around instead with their pickaxes. And so that's exactly what they do. They manage to rescue the new member of House Ang and immediately block it off again so that the two now imprisoned members of House Rushrul cannot escape. Well, that's it from me, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to let me know. It remains unclear at this point as to whether House Rushrul will be allowed to negotiate their release or whether they'll just starve to death on their own floor. That would be a nasty outcome for the fortress in general. But we'll have to find out next episode, guys. If you want to see more of this series, please let me know. I'd really love to keep this going. Don't forget to hit like and comment down below, letting me know what you want to see in the future. And if you want to keep up to date with the series and the rest of my Dwarf Fortress videos, don't forget to hit subscribe as well. And maybe you might want to have a look at some of my other Dwarf Fortress videos as well. But that's it from me, guys. Have a good one, and I'll see you later.